Story. Struggling dad repaired CEO's rare Ferrari. What she asked him next left everyone speechless. The scent of cheap syrup and sizzling pancakes was the first sign of morning in the small apartment above Mark's auto repair. It was a space defined by its limitations, the way the floor sloped near the window, the single bedroom that forced a father and daughter to share, the constant, faint smell of motor oil that clung to the curtains. But for Mark, it was the only home he could give Lily, and he would fill it with love if he couldn't fill it with anything else. He stood over the stove, a worn spatula in his hand. His tall frame stooped slightly. Grease was permanently etched into the lines of his knuckles, a testament to his trade, but his movements were gentle. He flipped a pancake, shaped vaguely like a heart, onto a colorful plastic plate. "One racing heart for the champion," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. Lily, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with a smudge of last night's marker on her cheek, giggled from her seat at the small, wobbly kitchen table. Her sketchbook was open beside her plate, a half-finished drawing of a futuristic winged car dominating the page. "It needs more horsepower, Daddy." Mark smiled, a genuine expression that temporarily erased the exhaustion from his eyes. "Everything always needs more horsepower with you. Eat up. The school bus won't wait for aspiring automotive designers." As she ate, her small feet kicking happily against the chair leg, Mark's gaze drifted to the counter. Tucked behind the salt and pepper shakers was a stack of brutal white envelopes, each with a cruel red stamp. Past due, the electric company, the water bill, a final notice from the bank about the garage's business loan. They were a silent, screaming chorus of his failure. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He was a master of engines, a man who could diagnose a misfire by sound alone, but he couldn't seem to get his own life to run smoothly. "Daddy?" Lily's voice cut through his anxiety. "After you fix all the boring cars today, can we get that new set of drawing markers? The ones with all the shiny colors?" Mark turned back to her, his smile now a carefully constructed mask. The markers cost $20. $20 he desperately needed for gas, for groceries, for the relentless chipping away at the mountain of debt. "Soon, sweetie. I promise," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "When the money fairy pays a visit." Lily seemed content with that, her imagination already picturing the mythical fairy. But for Mark, the lie was another small weight added to the crushing load on his shoulders. After he'd walked Lily to the bus stop, kissing her forehead and waving until the big yellow vehicle turned the corner, the quiet that settled over the garage was deafening. He walked down the creaky wooden stairs from the apartment into his domain. Mark's auto repair was his sanctuary and his prison. Every wrench, every socket, every screwdriver had its designated place on the pegboard walls. The concrete floor, though stained with the ghosts of 1,000 oil leaks, was swept clean. It was a space of meticulous order, a stark contrast to the chaos of his finances. Above the bay doors, a faded sign bore his name, the paint peeling around the edges. It felt less like a declaration and more like an apology. He walked to his small, cluttered office in the corner and sank into the squeaking chair, the stack of bills from the kitchen now sitting on his desk, looking even more menacing under the flickering fluorescent light. He ran a hand through his greasy hair, the knot in his stomach now a cold, hard stone. He was 35, and he felt ancient. His eyes fell on a framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was of his father, a younger, stronger version of himself, leaning against a 1969 Dodge Charger, a proud grin on his face. His father had started this garage. He'd had a gift, a passion that Mark inherited. But his father had also left him with the business's initial debts, a legacy of struggle that Mark had never managed to outrun. He often felt the weight of his father's knowing eyes from the photograph, a silent judgment on his inability to make the business thrive. He was a good mechanic. No, he was a brilliant mechanic. He knew it with a certainty that was at odds with his humble circumstances. He didn't just replace parts. He understood the soul of a machine. He could feel the subtle vibrations through the frame of a car and know a wheel bearing was about to fail. He could listen to the rhythm of an idle and diagnose a faulty injector. It was an intuitive, artistic gift, but it was being wasted on changing the oil in minivans and replacing the brake pads on decade-old sedans. The customers who appreciated true craftsmanship couldn't afford him, and the ones who could afford him went to the gleaming, soulless dealerships in the city. Driven by a familiar, masochistic impulse, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Beneath a pile of old invoices and parts catalogs was a large, leather-bound sketchbook. His sketchbook, he pulled it out, its weight familiar in his hands, and laid it on the desk. He blew a layer of dust off the cover and opened it. The pages were filled not with drawings of cars, but with the intricate, detailed schematics of their hearts. A complete hand-drawn blueprint of a flat-plane crank V8, a detailed analysis of a dual-clutch transmission system, and at the back, his ultimate dream, pages of layouts, business plans, and branding ideas for a high-end restoration shop. Legacy Motors, he had planned to call it, a place dedicated to preserving automotive history, to treating classic cars not as vehicles, but as art. The drawings were masterful, the notes precise. It was the work of a visionary, a man with a fire in his soul. He slammed the book shut. The sound echoed in the empty garage. What a joke. A visionary who couldn't even keep his lights on. He was a fool for even looking at it, for torturing himself with the ghost of a life he was supposed to live. He stood up, pushing the sketchbook back into its drawer tomb, and resigned himself to the day. A 2008 Honda Odyssey was his first appointment. An oil change and a tire rotation. Mundane, simple, safe. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and prepared to get to work. That's when he heard it. It started as a distant guttural roar, a sound completely alien to this quiet, forgotten street. It wasn't the asthmatic whine of a four-cylinder or the utilitarian rumble of a V6. This was a symphony of 12 cylinders, a deep-chested Italian baritone that spoke of raw power and breathtaking speed. The sound grew closer, a magnificent crescendo that made the hairs on Mark's arms stand up. He froze, his head cocked, listening. He knew that sound. It was the legendary music of a Colombo V12 engine. Then, the symphony faltered. The glorious roar devolved into a violent, sputtering cough. It was a pained, struggling sound, like a world-class singer suddenly choking. It was followed by a screech of expensive tires on asphalt, and then a final, expensive silence. Mark walked slowly out of the bay door, wiping his hands on a rag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He blinked against the morning sun, and there, stopped directly in front of his humble garage, was a legend. It was a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. Not a replica, not a kit car, he could tell instantly from the perfect, flowing lines of the Scaglietti bodywork, from the aggressive stance, from the sheer, overwhelming presence of it. Its paint was a lustrous, blood red, so deep it seemed you could drown in it. The car wasn't just parked, it looked like a predator that had reluctantly laid down to rest. It was beautiful, iconic, and, as one of only 36 ever made, practically priceless. A driver's side door, impossibly light, swung open. A single high-heeled shoe, worth more than Mark's monthly mortgage payment, met the cracked pavement. Then, a woman emerged. She was tall, poised, and dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that screamed power and wealth. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and her face was a mask of controlled frustration. She pulled out a sleek smartphone and stabbed at the screen with an impatient finger. She didn't even seem to notice Mark or his garage at first. She was an island of immense wealth and influence, momentarily stranded in his ocean of mediocrity. Mark stood there, frozen, the greasy rag clutched in his hand. The world seemed to slow down. The mundane Honda Odyssey waiting in his bay, the pile of bills on his desk, the gnawing feeling of failure, it all faded into the background. All that existed was the man, the woman, and the wounded masterpiece of engineering that sat between them. It was a ghost from his own dreams, parked on the fractured asphalt of his reality, and he had no idea what was about to happen next. The woman's name was Isabella Rossi, though Mark didn't know that yet. To him, she was simply an invading force, an emissary from a world so far removed from his own it might as well have been another planet. She paced back and forth in front of the Ferrari, her heels clicking an angry staccato on the pavement. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice clipped and sharp. "No. I don't know where I am, Richard. Some back street. The car is dead. Yes, I'm aware of the board meeting. I'm not an idiot." She paused, listening, her jaw tight. "A tow truck? For this car? Are you insane? Just find a way to get me to the office, and find someone who can handle this without scratching the paint." She hung up, exhaling a frustrated sigh that condensed in the cool morning air. It was only then that her gaze finally landed on Mark's garage, and then on Mark himself. She scanned him from head to toe, the grease-stained coveralls, the worn-out work boots, the cheap rag in his hand. A flicker of dismissal, almost pity, crossed her face before being replaced by a professionally neutral mask. Mark felt an old, familiar defensiveness rise in him. It was the look he got from people who equated his dirty hands with a simple mind. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet her gaze. He cleared his throat. Having some trouble? The words sounded inadequate, impossibly small in the presence of the magnificent machine and its formidable owner. Isabella's eyes, a sharp, intelligent brown, narrowed slightly. She seemed to be calculating the odds, weighing the inconvenience of her situation against the perceived incompetence of her surroundings. "It would appear so," she said, her voice as crisp and tailored as her suit. She didn't look at him, her attention already drifting back to her phone. "My usual mechanic is on the other side of town. A specialist. I don't suppose you handle vintage Ferraris?" The unspoken addendum hung in the air. "Of course you don't." The dismissive tone was like a spark on dry tinder. Mark's professional pride, the one thing his financial struggles hadn't managed to extinguish, flared to life. He knew this car, not just from pictures. He knew the firing order of its cylinders, the precise tolerance of its valve clearances, the unique temperament of its 6 Weber carburetors. He had spent countless nights of his youth studying its schematics in his father's old manuals, dreaming. He took a step forward, his eyes drawn not to her, but to the car. He could already see it wasn't an external issue. The way it had died, a sudden, violent cough, rather than a slow fade, spoke of a fuel or ignition problem, something deep within its mechanical heart. "I know a thing or two," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. He gestured towards the open bay. "Let me take a look. No charge to diagnose." Isabella finally gave him her full attention. She looked from his earnest, focused face to the faded sign above his garage, Mark's Auto Repair. It sounded so painfully generic. Her specialist, Jean-Pierre, worked in a climate-controlled facility that looked more like a science lab than a garage. He wore a pristine white coat and charged $1,000 just to lift the hood. This man was offering to do it for free. The offer was either a sign of charity or a trap. In her world, nothing of value was ever free. "Fine," she said, the word clipped. Desperation was clearly winning the battle against her better judgment. She had a $10 billion merger to finalize in less than 3 hours. "But be careful. This car is irreplaceable." The word hung between them, a warning and a statement of fact. It wasn't just metal and paint. It was a rolling piece of history, an investment, a legacy. Mark simply nodded. He didn't need the warning. As he approached the vehicle, a sense of reverence washed over him, quieting the storm of his personal anxieties. He ran a hand gently over the fender, his fingertips tracing the iconic curve. The metal was cool, smooth, perfect. It felt like shaking hands with a hero. "Mind if I pop the hood?" he asked. Isabella gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. With a practiced movement, Mark found the release latch inside the driver's side door and pulled. The long, elegant hood, the Cofano, lifted with a soft click. He propped it open, and his breath caught in his throat. There it was, the Colombo V12. 12 cylinders, a tangled but beautiful web of wiring and fuel lines, 6 dual-barrel carburetors lined up like a rank of soldiers. To the untrained eye, it was a chaotic mess of machinery. To Mark, it was a symphony orchestra waiting for its conductor. His eyes scanned the engine bay with an expert's efficiency. He wasn't just looking, he was reading a story. He saw the faint sheen of fuel near the base of the third carburetor, the slight, almost invisible misalignment of the distributor cap, the modern, incorrect spark plug wires someone had installed. This engine had been violated by an amateur. He leaned closer, inhaling the scent of gasoline and hot metal. "It's not a major failure," he said, almost to himself. Isabella, who had moved to stand beside him, crossed her arms. "What makes you so sure?" "Because a major failure sounds different," Mark replied, not looking at her. His focus was absolute. Catastrophic engine failure is a bang, a clatter, a death rattle. This was a choke. It's starving or it's suffocating, fuel or spark. He pointed with a steady, grease-stained finger. "Your fuel pump is aftermarket. It's not delivering consistent pressure. And the ignition timing, it's off. Significantly. Someone tried to tune this by the book. But this engine doesn't follow the book. It has its own personality. You have to listen to it. For the first time since she'd stepped out of the car, Isabella was silent. She stared at the man, at the quiet confidence radiating from him. The two previous mechanics, both from reputable city shops, had been stumped. They had connected diagnostic computers which were useless on a car this old and talked about a full system replacement, quoting her figures that would make even her pause. This man, in his rundown garage, had diagnosed the problem in less than 2 minutes with nothing but his own senses. Before she could formulate a response, the creak of the apartment stairs announced a new arrival. Lily appeared in the doorway of the garage, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She stopped short, her eyes going wide as they took in the scene. Her father, a stranger who looked like she was from a movie, and the most beautiful car she had ever seen. It was even better than the one she drew. "Daddy," she said, her voice a small whisper. Mark's entire demeanor softened as he turned to her. The focused, almost intimidating expert vanished, replaced by the gentle father. "Hey, sweetie, I thought you'd be at the bus stop." "Ah, I forgot my lunch," she said, holding up a small brown paper bag. She took a few hesitant steps closer, her gaze fixed on the Ferrari. "Whoa, it's real." Isabella found herself looking at the child. At her bright, curious face, her wide, innocent eyes. There was no calculation there, no agenda, just pure, unadulterated wonder. A feeling Isabella herself hadn't experienced in a very long time. Lily, emboldened by her father's presence, walked right up to Isabella. She held up her sketchbook, flipping it open to the drawing she'd been working on that morning. "I drew your car," she announced proudly. Isabella was taken aback. She looked down at the drawing. It was a child's creation, of course, with wobbly lines and exaggerated features, but the details were surprisingly accurate. The triple air intakes on the nose, the distinctive side vents, the vibrant red color. The girl hadn't just drawn a car. She had drawn this car. A crack, small but significant, appeared in Isabella's stern facade. She looked from the drawing to Lily's hopeful face, and a smile, a real, unforced smile, touched her lips. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice softer now. "You have your father's eye for detail." The compliment landed on Mark with surprising weight. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like a lifeline. He looked at Isabella, truly seeing her for the first time not as a symbol of everything he wasn't, but as a person. "Can you fix it?" Isabella asked, her tone shifting. The sharp edge was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity. Mark nodded slowly. "I can, but it will take time. I'll need to recalibrate the fuel pump and reset the timing by ear. And those spark plug wires?" He shook his head. "They have to go. They're causing a weak spark. I'll have to fabricate a period, correct set." Fabricate?" The words stunned her. The other mechanics talked about ordering parts. This man was talking about making them. "How long?" she asked. Mark did a quick calculation in his head, factoring in the meticulous care required. "To do it right. A day. Maybe 2. Isabella's face fell. "2 days? I don't have 2 days. I have a meeting in less than 3 hours. "I can get it running for you," Mark offered. "A temporary fix. Enough to get you across town. But it won't be right. It'll be a patch, and this car deserves more than a patch. It deserves to be perfect." There was that word again. Perfect. It was the same standard she applied to every aspect of her own life, from her business deals to her wardrobe. To hear it from this man, in this place, was deeply unsettling and strangely reassuring. She looked at her watch. She looked at the car, her father's car, the last tangible piece of him she had left. He had been a man who appreciated perfection, who believed in doing a job the right way or not at all. What would he say if he saw her letting someone put a patch on his pride and joy? She made a decision. The $10 billion merger could wait. Richard could handle the preliminary motions. This felt more important. 2 days, she said, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. It was an eternity in her schedule. "Do it right. I want it to be perfect." Mark stared at her, a wave of shock and exhilaration washing over him. He had just been entrusted with his dream car. He felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose, that he hadn't felt in years. "I'll need to get it inside," he said, his voice now filled with a quiet energy. "The battery is probably fine. If you put it in neutral, I can push it into the bay." Isabella nodded, sliding gracefully back into the driver's seat. She put the car in neutral, her movements precise. Mark positioned himself at the back of the Ferrari. He placed his hands on the cool, curved metal. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the weight of the machine, the weight of the opportunity. This wasn't a Honda Odyssey. This was a test, a chance to prove, if only to himself, that the visionary in the sketchbook wasn't dead after all. He took a deep breath, planted his feet, and began to push. And slowly, silently, the priceless legend rolled forward, leaving the world of power and money behind as it crossed the threshold into Mark's humble garage. With the Ferrari safely inside, the bay door rolled shut, cocooning them in a world of steel, oil, and silence. The garage, which had always felt small and confining to Mark, suddenly transformed into a private, consecrated space. The ordinary chaos of the street was gone, replaced by the immense, quiet presence of the car. It sat under the fluorescent lights, its red paint glowing with an inner fire, looking less like a machine and more like a sleeping dragon. Isabella stood near the wall, her arms crossed, a portrait of incongruity. Her sharp, expensive suit was a stark contrast to the utilitarian surroundings. She looked utterly out of her element, a CEO without a boardroom, a commander without her army. She glanced at her platinum watch, an anxious habit she couldn't shake. Mark ignored her, not out of rudeness, but out of total, all-consuming focus. He wasn't thinking about her, her wealth, or the bills on his desk anymore. He was communicating with the car. His first move wasn't to grab a wrench. Instead, he pulled over a rolling stool and a powerful work light. He circled the engine bay slowly, the light's bright beam cutting through the shadows, illuminating every hose, wire, and clamp. He was like a detective examining a crime scene, or a doctor studying a patient before an operation. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, and deeply respectful. Isabella watched, her impatience warring with a growing sense of curiosity. She was used to a world of rapid-fire decisions, of instant results and delegated tasks. This slow, methodical ritual was completely alien to her. Finally, Mark began. He laid out a clean fender cover over the Ferrari's delicate bodywork. He selected his first tool, a simple screwdriver from the pegboard with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. He started with the improperly installed spark plug wires, his fingers working deftly to disconnect them. He didn't just yank them off. He treated each connection point with care, his touch firm but gentle. He labeled each wire with a piece of masking tape and laid them out on his workbench in perfect order. The silence was broken by the shrill ring of Isabella's phone. She answered it with a quiet but firm, "Rossi." She listened, her back stiffening. "Postpone it," she commanded. "No, I don't care what their schedule looks like. We are the ones acquiring them, not the other way around. They will wait. Handle it, Richard." She hung up without waiting for a reply and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The decision was made. For the next 48 hours, her $10 billion empire would have to run itself. Her attention returned to Mark. He was now working on the fuel pump. He had a small tray next to him, and as he removed each screw and component, he cleaned it with a solvent-dampened rag and placed it carefully in the tray. He wasn't just fixing the problem. He was erasing the clumsy mistakes of the mechanic who came before him. There was no wasted motion, no frustration, no shortcuts. It was a silent, powerful demonstration of mastery. "Why are you cleaning the old screws?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Aren't you just going to put them back in?" Mark paused, looking up from his work. "Dirt and grit can throw off the torque specs," he said simply, "and it's a matter of respect. You wouldn't put a masterpiece back in a dirty frame." "Ah!" The answer caught her off guard. Respect. It was a word she understood in the context of power dynamics and business negotiations, but she had never considered it in relation to nuts and bolts. She found herself moving closer, drawn in by his quiet intensity. An hour melted into 2. Mark had successfully removed the faulty fuel pump and was now disassembling it on his workbench. He handled the small, intricate parts with the same reverence he'd shown the car itself. He was completely absorbed, a man in a state of flow, doing the one thing in the world he was born to do. Just as the atmosphere was becoming thick with unspoken questions, the door from the apartment creaked open again. Lily tiptoed in, holding 2 juice boxes and a small bag of cookies. She had changed out of her school clothes and into a pair of overalls that were a miniature version of her father's comps. She walked first to Mark. "I thought you might be thirsty, Daddy." Thanks, sweetie," he said, taking the juice box but not breaking his focus on the delicate gasket he was examining. Then, with a bravery that astounded Isabella, Lily walked over to her and held out the other juice box and the bag of cookies. "You probably need a snack too," Lily said matter-of-factly, watching his hard work. Isabella stared at the offering. A juice box. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a juice box. She took it, her fingers brushing against the child's. The simple act of kindness felt monumental. "Thank you, Lily," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. Lily beamed and then turned her attention to the workbench. "What's that part, Daddy?" "This is a diaphragm from the fuel pump," Mark explained patiently, pointing with the tip of a clean screwdriver. "It's like a little lung. It's supposed to pulse and push the fuel to the engine. But this one has a tiny tear in it, see? So it can't breathe properly." "Ugh." Lily leaned in, her expression serious. "So the car has asthma?" Mark chuckled, a deep, genuine sound that filled the garage. "Exactly. The car has asthma. And I'm the doctor who's going to help it breathe again." Isabella watched the exchange, a strange ache forming in her chest. There was a purity to their interaction, a simple, unvarnished love that money could not buy and power could not command. It was a glimpse into a life she had never known, a life of small, meaningful moments. She found herself sitting on a sturdy wooden stool a few feet away, sipping her juice, the cookies forgotten on the bench beside her. The garage no longer felt like a prison, it felt like a haven. The smell of oil and solvent was no longer offensive. It was the smell of honest work, of creation. Mark finished his analysis of the fuel pump. He had identified the torn diaphragm and a weakened spring. These were small, inexpensive parts, but they were the root of the entire problem. "It's been neglected," Mark said, more to himself than to her. He held up the tiny, torn piece of rubber. "Someone should have caught this. A car like this, it talks to you. You just have to know how to listen." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "My father used to say that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark looked up, sensing the shift in her tone. He gave her his full attention. "He was the one who bought it," Isabella continued, her gaze distant, fixed on the car but seeing something else entirely. "He wasn't born into money. He built his company from nothing. He loved machines, engineering, things that were built with passion and precision. He said they were honest. A machine won't lie to you. It either works or it doesn't." She stood up and walked over to the car, running a hand along its fender, mirroring the gesture Mark had made earlier. "He bought this car the year I was born. It was his greatest extravagance. He called it Isabella's Folly because he said buying it was the most beautifully irresponsible thing he'd ever done. On Sundays, he wouldn't wear a suit. He'd put on old jeans and he'd work on this car, right here in the garage. He'd let me sit in the driver's seat and pretend to drive. He taught me the names of all the parts." A sad smile touched her lips. "He passed away 5 years ago. This car, it's the last part of him I have left. When I'm in it, I can almost hear his voice, feel him sitting beside me." Her corporate armor had fallen away completely, revealing the vulnerable daughter beneath. "The mechanics I took it to, they saw a price tag, an asset. They wanted to rip out its heart and replace it with something new. They didn't understand." She turned to face Mark, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're the first person who seems to understand. You see it the same way he did." A profound silence settled over the garage. The weight of her confession hung in the air. Mark looked from her vulnerable face to the magnificent car, and suddenly his task was transformed. He wasn't just fixing a fuel pump. He wasn't just repairing an engine. He was preserving a memory. He was tending to the last connection between a daughter and her father. The $20 for Lily's markers, the overdue bills, the weight of his own failures, it all felt insignificant now. This job was no longer about money. It was about something far more valuable. It was a sacred trust. "I'll fix it," Mark said, his voice quiet but filled with a new, unshakable resolve. "I'll make it perfect for you, for him." The confession hung in the air long after the words were spoken, fundamentally altering the atmosphere in the garage. It was no longer a transaction between a client and a mechanic. It had become a collaboration, a shared mission. Isabella's revelation had given Mark more than just context. It had given him purpose. The Ferrari was no longer just a priceless machine. It was a reliquary, a vessel for a cherished memory, and he was now its sworn protector. A new energy coursed through him. He moved with an even greater sense of deliberation, his every action infused with the gravity of his promise. The diaphragm and spring are simple enough to source, Mark began, his tone shifting from diagnostic to creative. But these spark plug wires, they're a problem. He picked up one of the modern, plastic-coated wires the previous mechanic had installed. They're functionally adequate, but aesthetically, they're an insult to the engine. They're too thick, the wrong color, and the material is all wrong. Your father would have hated them. Isabella, who had regained her composure, watched him, intrigued. What do you propose? I propose we make a new set, Mark said, his eyes alight with a creative fire she was beginning to recognize, the way they would have in 2062. Lacquered cloth wiring, with period-correct brass terminals and ceramic boots. It won't just look right, it will deliver a more consistent spark. It's what the engine wants. Isabella stared at him. You can just make them. Mark gestured to a corner of the garage she hadn't paid much attention to before. It was an older, more specialized set of equipment, a small lathe, a spooling machine, various gauges and crimping tools. It was the equipment of a craftsman, not just a repairman. It's what I do, he said simply. Or, what I used to dream of doing, anyway. He didn't wait for her permission. He knew he already had it. He pulled out spools of cloth-covered wire, brass fittings, and ceramic insulators from a dusty but well-organized cabinet. It was a cache of materials he had collected over the years for projects he never had the time or money to start. Now, they had found their purpose. For the next several hours, Isabella witnessed an act of pure creation. Mark measured the old wires to get the precise lengths. He carefully stripped the ends of the cloth-covered wire, his movements economical and exact. He used the crimping tool to attach the brass terminals, each one perfectly seated. He then fitted the ceramic boots, ensuring a snug, weatherproof seal. It was a slow, painstaking process. There were no shortcuts, no compromises. Lily, finished with her homework, returned to the garage and pulled up a stool, watching her father with rapt attention. She didn't interrupt with questions now. She seemed to understand, with a child's intuition, that she was witnessing something special. She began to sketch in her notebook. Not a futuristic car this time, but her father's hands as they worked, capturing the focused intensity of his craft. Isabella found herself completely captivated. She had sat through hundreds of presentations on product design and manufacturing, filled with slick graphics and corporate jargon. But this was different. This was real. She was watching a single man, with his own two hands, transform raw materials into something not only functional but beautiful. He was speaking a language she didn't know, a language of tactile skill and intuitive engineering, but she understood its meaning perfectly. It was a language of passion. As he worked, a comfortable quiet settled between them. Mark would occasionally explain what he was doing, not for her approval, but as if thinking aloud, sharing his process. The lacquer on the cloth isn't just for color, he explained, as he threaded a finished wire through a loom. It protects the wire from heat and oil. Modern plastic is more durable, maybe, but it doesn't breathe. It traps heat. This engine needs to breathe. My father's company makes advanced polymer composites, Isabella said, the thought occurring to her suddenly. We create materials for aerospace and medical applications. Lighter than aluminum, stronger than steel. We spend billions on research and development to innovate. Mark paused, holding a finished wire up to the light. Innovation is important, he agreed. But sometimes progress means forgetting something important, something true. There's a reason a Stradivarius violin sounds the way it does. It's not just the design, it's the wood, the varnish, the hands that made it. You can't 3D print that. His words struck a chord deep within her. Her entire career was built on the relentless pursuit of the next big thing, of disruption and forward momentum. She rarely, if ever, looked back. But watching Mark, she realized there was a profound wisdom in the old ways, a value in preservation that her world had mostly forgotten. By late afternoon, Mark had completed the full set of 12 spark plug wires. He laid them out on the workbench, a perfect, matching set, their deep black cloth sheathing and gleaming brass terminals looking like automotive jewelry. They were, in their own way, a work of art. "They're perfect," Isabella breathed, reaching out but stopping herself before she touched them. "Now for the timing," Mark said, his energy seemingly endless. This was the most delicate part of the operation. He installed the new wires, his fingers moving with practiced ease, connecting them to the distributor cap and spark plugs in the correct firing order. He reinstalled the repaired fuel pump. He checked every connection, every hose, every clamp. Then he put the key in the ignition. "Stand back," he said. He turned the key. The engine cranked, then caught with a deafening roar. It was a raw, untamed sound, much louder and more aggressive than before. It wasn't the smooth purr he was aiming for. It was the sound of a patient waking up angry from surgery. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust pipes. Mark immediately shut it off. Lily jumped, her eyes wide. Isabella felt a pang of disappointment, but Mark was smiling. "Good," he said. "She's awake. Now we can talk to her." For the next hour, he performed a delicate dance that was part science, part intuition. He would loosen the bolt on the distributor, turn it by a fraction of a millimeter, then start the car again. He would listen intently for a few seconds, his head tilted, his eyes closed, before shutting it off and making another minuscule adjustment. He was tuning the engine like a priceless instrument, not by sight but by sound. He adjusted the idle screws on the 6 carburetors, turning one a quarter turn, then another an eighth, listening to the subtle changes in the engine's rhythm. He was balancing them, making sure each of the 12 cylinders was receiving the exact same delicate mixture of fuel and air. Isabella watched, mesmerized. This was the nuance the other mechanics had missed. They had looked at a manual and seen specifications. Mark was listening to a conversation and hearing a language. With each adjustment, the engine's roar became smoother, the rough edges softening. The angry, guttural snarl was slowly being tamed into a deep, powerful, and perfectly balanced thrum. The black smoke from the exhaust disappeared, replaced by a clean, invisible stream. Finally, after one last, tiny adjustment, Mark let the engine run. He stood back, wiping a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. The sound was perfect. It was a deep, resonant purr that filled the garage with a powerful, vibrating harmony. It was the sound of health, of power, held in perfect reserve. It was the sound Isabella remembered from her childhood, the sound of Sunday mornings with her father. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time, she didn't bother to hide them. Mark turned off the engine, and the resulting silence was somehow just as beautiful as the sound had been. She started, her voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect. It sounds exactly like it used to." Mark gave a small, tired nod. The adrenaline was fading, and the exhaustion of the long day was finally setting in. "That's the sound of a happy engine," he said. He began to clean up his tools, his movements slow but still meticulous. Isabella watched him, her mind racing. She had come here by accident, a powerful CEO stranded by a broken-down car. She had met a struggling mechanic in a rundown garage. But over the course of the day, her perspective had completely shifted. She hadn't found a mechanic. She had found an artist, a master of a dying craft, a man with more integrity in his little finger than half the executives on her board. And he was here, wasting his incredible talent on oil changes and tire rotations, drowning in a sea of debt. It wasn't just wrong, it was a tragedy. And Isabella Rossi was not a woman who stood by and let tragedies happen when she had the power to prevent them. A new idea, bold and audacious, began to form in her mind. It was a proposal that had nothing to do with fixing a single car, and everything to do with changing a life. The dawn of the second day broke with a sense of quiet anticipation. Mark had been at the garage since before sunrise, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to complete his work to the standard he had set for himself. The Ferrari's engine now ran with the precision of a Swiss watch, but the job wasn't finished. A masterpiece deserved more than just a perfect heart. Its entire being had to be respected. When Isabella arrived, driven by a town car that looked ridiculously plain parked next to the garage, she found Mark not under the hood, but meticulously cleaning the car. He wasn't using a bucket and sponge. He was using a specialized detailing clay to lift microscopic impurities from the paint, his hands gliding over the crimson curves with a practiced, gentle touch. He had already cleaned and conditioned the rich leather of the interior, which now glowed with a soft, supple sheen. He had even polished the chrome on the wire-spoke Barani wheels until they shone like mirrors. He was treating the car not as a job to be finished, but as a guest of honor to be cared for. Lily sat on her stool, helping by carefully dusting the tires with a soft cloth, her face a mask of serious concentration. Isabella stood in the doorway for a moment, simply observing. The scene was so profoundly peaceful, so far removed from the aggressive, high-stakes world she inhabited. Her phone had been buzzing all morning with urgent updates about the postponed merger, but she found she couldn't summon her usual sense of urgency. The dramas of the corporate world felt distant and strangely insignificant compared to the quiet integrity of the scene before her. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft, so as not to break the spell. Mark looked up and smiled, a real, unrestrained smile that reached his eyes. The exhaustion from the previous day was gone, replaced by the quiet pride of a job well done. "She's almost ready for you," he said. "Just wanted to make sure she was presentable." "She's more than presentable, Mark. She's magnificent." He gave a final, loving wipe to the fender and stood up, peeling off his gloves. He walked over to the workbench and began neatly organizing his tools, his movements signaling the completion of his work. "It's done," he announced. "The fuel pump is rebuilt, the carburetors are balanced, the ignition system is perfect. I took the liberty of checking the fluids and topping up the oil with the correct vintage-grade synthetic. She should run better than she has in years." Isabella circled the car, her expression unreadable now. She ran a hand over the gleaming paint, her touch as reverent as Mark's had been. She opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of clean leather and faint, pleasant polish filled her senses. It felt alive again. She turned the key. The engine fired instantly, with no hesitation. It settled into that perfect, deep, resonant purr he had orchestrated the day before. The sound filled the small garage, a testament to the master craftsman who had awakened it. She revved the engine once, a crisp, powerful bark that echoed with flawless health. The needle on the tachometer danced and settled back to a perfectly steady idle. She turned it off, the silence rushing back in. She got out of the car, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at Mark, who was wiping his hands on a clean rag, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He wasn't looking for praise. His reward was in the work itself. "Incredible," she said, and the single word was filled with a world of meaning. "It hasn't sounded this good since my father, since a long time ago. What do I owe you?" This was the moment Mark had been dreading, the transactional part. It felt vulgar to put a price on the last 2 days, to reduce this profound experience to a simple invoice. He had poured his heart and soul into this car, but he was still a businessman with bills to pay. He had wrestled with the number all morning. He thought about the hours he'd put in, the specialized skill it required, the price the city mechanics would have charged. He could probably ask for $10,000, and she wouldn't blink. But he couldn't do it. It would betray the spirit of the work, the trust she had placed in him. It would make him no better than the men who saw the car as nothing more than an asset. He walked over to his cluttered desk and picked up a small, neatly written invoice he had prepared. He smoothed it out and handed it to her. The parts, the diaphragm kit, the wire, the terminals, the proper oil came to $173.50, he said, his voice steady. For the labor, $500 should cover it. So, $673.50. Isabella stared at the piece of paper, then at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something else deep, profound respect. "That's it," she said, her voice quiet. $500 for 2 days of work? For fabricating parts by hand? That's not a price, Mark. That's a gift." "I'm not them," he said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "That's a fair price for the work I did. It's what I would charge anyone." It was a simple statement of his own code of ethics. He charged for his time and his skill, not for the depth of his clients' pockets. It was a principle that had kept him poor, but it had also allowed him to look himself in the mirror every morning. Isabella looked at him, truly seeing the core of the man. The world she knew was filled with people who would take every possible advantage, who believed that charging what the market would bear was the only smart way to do business. Mark's integrity was so pure, so unbending, it was almost jarring. It was a rare and precious commodity, and she knew, with the certainty of a CEO spotting an undervalued asset, that it was worth far more than $500. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. She uncapped an expensive fountain pen, its nib scratching softly as she began to write. Mark watched, his stomach in knots. That check represented food on the table, another month of keeping the bank at bay, and maybe, just maybe, that new set of markers for Lily. But then Isabella stopped. She looked at the check, then at Mark, then at Lily, who had come to stand by her father's side, hugging his leg. Her eyes took in the whole scene. The brilliant, struggling mechanic, his bright, loving daughter, the magnificent car that now ran perfectly because of his talent and integrity. An idea which had been simmering since the day before, now crystallized into a concrete plan. It was audacious, unconventional, and made perfect business sense in a way that had nothing to do with balance sheets. She tore the half-written check from the book, ripped it cleanly in two, and let the pieces flutter onto the desk. She put the checkbook and pen back in her purse. "I won't insult you by arguing about the price for this job," she said, her tone shifting back to the decisive cadence of a CEO. "You've set your price, and I accept it. I'll have my assistant wire the funds immediately, but I have a different proposal for you. A business proposal." Mark looked completely bewildered. "A business proposal?" "Yes," Isabella continued, her eyes sharp and focused. "I told you about my father. What I didn't tell you is that when he passed, he left me his entire classic car collection. It's not just the Ferrari. There are 34 cars in a private, climate-controlled facility on my estate. A 1,957 Mercedes Gullwing. A 1965 Aston Martin Deblima. A 71 Lamborghini Miura SV. She took a step closer, her voice low and compelling. "They are all works of art, just like this one. And right now, they are being managed by a team that sees them as investments to be polished and maintained. They keep them running, but they don't understand their souls. They don't have the right touch. They don't have your respect." Mark's jaw had gone slack. He was trying to process the list of legendary cars she had just rattled off. It was a collection that belonged in a world-class museum. "I don't need a mechanic, Mark," Isabella said, her voice resonating with sincerity. "I need a curator. A head curator for the Rossi collection. I need a master craftsman who doesn't just see assets but sees art. Someone with patience, passion, and an unbending sense of integrity. Someone who will preserve my father's legacy, not just his cars." Her gaze was locked on his. "The position comes with a private state-of-the-art workshop on the estate grounds, a full budget for tools, parts, and restorations, a comprehensive benefits package for you and your daughter, and a salary that would mean you never have to look at a pile of unpaid bills again." She let the offer hang in the air, a breathtaking proposition that seemed to bend reality around it. "It's yours, Mark," she said softly, "if you want it." Mark was utterly, completely speechless. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He couldn't connect the words she was saying to his own life. The dusty garage, the screaming red bills, the constant grinding anxiety that was his reality. The world she was describing was a fantasy, a dream he had packed away in a sketchbook years ago. He looked from Isabella's serious, hopeful face to the gleaming Ferrari, the physical proof of his own talent. Then he looked down at Lily. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, sparkling with a universe of wonder. She had understood the words, "all the cars." "Daddy," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "A real race car? All of them?" The simple, innocent question shattered his paralysis. The immense weight of years of struggle, of feeling like a failure, of telling his daughter soon, finally cracked. Tears welled up in his eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grease on his cheek. He tried to speak, to say yes, to thank her, but no words would come. He could only nod, a convulsive, jerky motion, as the full magnitude of the offer washed over him. He was being offered more than a job. He was being offered a new life. He was being offered his dream. Isabella's professional mask finally melted away completely, replaced by a wide, warm, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. She extended a hand. "Welcome to the team, Mr. Evans." Mark took her hand, his rough, callous grip meeting her firm, smooth one. It wasn't the handshake of a mechanic and a client. It was the handshake of partners. The week that followed Isabella's proposal was a surreal blur for Mark. It felt as though he were living in someone else's dream, constantly waiting for the jarring alarm clock of reality to wake him up. But reality never came. Instead, it was replaced by a series of efficient, life-altering events orchestrated by Isabella's formidable assistant, Richard. Richard, whose sharp voice Mark recognized from the phone call on that first morning, turned out to be a whirlwind of quiet competency. He arrived at the garage 2 days later, not in a flashy car, but in a practical sedan, holding a sleek leather portfolio. He was a man in his late 50s with kind eyes that belied his brutally efficient demeanor. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Mr. Evans," he began, shaking Mark's hand firmly. "Miss Rossi has asked me to facilitate your transition. I have your employment contract here, along with the preliminary paperwork for your new housing." He spread the documents on the clean workbench. Mark stared at the official letterhead, the crisp black ink, the sheer weight of the paper. He saw the salary figure and felt his knees go weak. It was more than he had made in the last 3 years combined. He saw the benefits package: full medical, dental, a retirement plan. It was a language of security he had never been able to speak. "There's also the matter of this garage," Richard continued, gesturing to the space around them. Miss Rossi was quite clear. "She believes a man's legacy should be honored, not abandoned. She has authorized me to settle your outstanding business loan with the bank in full. Furthermore, she has arranged for a commercial real estate agent to manage the sale of the property. The proceeds, of course, will be entirely yours." Mark was speechless. He had assumed he would just have to lock the door and walk away, leaving the monument to his family's struggle to be devoured by the bank. The idea that Isabella would not only give him a future but also help him properly close the door on his past was an act of profound, almost unbelievable kindness. I don't know what to say," Mark stammered, feeling utterly overwhelmed. "Saying yes is sufficient," Richard said with a rare, small smile. "Isabella is not a woman who does things by halves. She believes in people, and when she does, she invests in them completely. Welcome to the company, Mark." The most difficult conversation was yet to come. That evening, after Lily was asleep, Mark sat at his wobbly kitchen table and pulled out the framed photograph of his father. He stared at the young, hopeful man leaning against his Dodge Charger, the ghost who had silently watched over Mark's struggles for so long. "Well, Dad," Mark whispered to the photograph, his voice thick with emotion, "I am letting it go. The garage. All of it." He felt a pang of guilt, as if he were betraying a sacred duty. This garage was his inheritance, the last physical link to the man who had taught him everything. For years, he had fought to keep it afloat, believing it was what his father would have wanted. But as he looked at the photo, he saw it differently now. He saw the pride in his father's eyes, but he also saw the grease under his fingernails, the weariness in his posture that he had never noticed before. His father had been a brilliant mechanic too. Had he also dreamed of more? Had he also felt trapped by the endless cycle of oil changes and brake jobs? I think you would have wanted this for me," Mark said, his voice gaining confidence. "A real chance to work on cars that matter, to build something, to not have to worry, just for a little while." He traced the outline of his father's face with his finger. "I'm going to make you proud." He felt a sense of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. He wasn't abandoning his father's legacy. He was finally, truly fulfilling its potential. Packing up the small apartment was a bittersweet process. Every object held a memory. The faded spot on the wall where Lily had thrown a spoonful of spaghetti as a toddler. The mismatched coffee mugs they had collected from thrift stores. The small, lumpy couch where they had spent countless evenings reading stories together. It was a life built on scarcity, but it had also been filled with love. "Are we taking my drawings?" Lily asked, her small hands carefully stacking her sketchbooks. "We're taking everything that matters, sweetie," Mark said, ruffling her hair. The last thing to be packed was the garage itself. Mark went through his tools, his hands caressing the worn, familiar grips. Each wrench, each socket, held the memory of 1,000 repairs. He packed his most essential personal tools, the ones his father had given him, into a sturdy wooden chest. The rest, the tools of the trade that belonged to the garage, he left neatly on the pegboard for the next owner. His final act was to take down the faded Mark's Auto Repair sign. As he unbolted it from the wall, he felt a chapter of his life definitively closing. He leaned it against the wall inside the empty bay, a final, silent farewell. The day of the move arrived, a bright, clear Saturday. A sleek black SUV, far too luxurious for their neighborhood, pulled up in front of the garage. Richard stepped out of the driver's seat. "Ready to go, Mark?" he asked. Mark took one last look at the empty apartment, then down at the garage. He took Lily's hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around his. "Ready?" The drive out of the city was a journey into another world. The gritty urban landscape of cracked pavement and brick buildings slowly gave way to leafy suburbs, which then dissolved into rolling green countryside. They drove for nearly an hour, deeper into a landscape of pristine horse farms and ancient oak trees. Finally, Richard slowed the SUV and turned onto a private road marked by an elegant but understated stone gate. There was no name, no grand announcement. The gate swung open silently as they approached. They drove down a long, winding driveway flanked by perfectly manicured lawns. And then, the house came into view. It wasn't a house, it was an estate. A magnificent stone manor, old but immaculately maintained, sat atop a gentle hill overlooking a sparkling lake. It was a picture of old-world wealth and quiet elegance. "Miss Rossi's residence," Richard said simply. Lily's face was pressed against the window, her mouth a perfect O of astonishment. "Is that a castle, Daddy?" Mark couldn't answer. He felt a surge of imposter syndrome so strong it almost made him dizzy. What was he, a backstreet mechanic, doing here? But Richard didn't drive toward the main house. He took a side road that led past a grove of birch trees and toward a separate, long, low-slung building. It was modern in design, with clean lines of glass and gray stone that complemented the natural landscape. It looked more like a modern art museum than a garage. Richard parked the SUV. "This is your new office," he said, "and just over that rise is your new home." Mark got out of the car, his legs feeling unsteady. He took Lily's hand again, her small presence a grounding force. Richard led them to a set of large, frosted glass doors. He pressed a button, and the doors slid open with a soft, satisfying hiss. Mark stepped inside, and his world stopped. He was standing in a cathedral of automotive excellence. The space was vast, bright, and impossibly clean. The floor was polished white epoxy, reflecting the soft glow of the recessed lighting above. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of clean metal and expensive wax. And then he saw them. Lined up in perfect, gleaming rows were the cars. His eyes darted from one to the next, his brain struggling to process the sheer magnificence of it all. The silver Aston Martin DB5, radiating an aura of effortless cool. The iconic, gull-wing doors of the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, pointing to the ceiling like a modern sculpture. The aggressive, wedge-shaped fury of the Lamborghini Miura, its bright orange paint so vibrant it almost hurt to look at. A majestic, deep blue Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. A row of classic Porsches, Ferraris, and Jaguars. Each one was a legend. Each one was a masterpiece. Each one was now his responsibility. Against the far wall was a state-of-the-art workshop that made his old garage look like a prehistoric cave. There were hydraulic lifts built flush into the floor, a full suite of brand-new diagnostic equipment, a computerized paint-matching booth, and rows of gleaming tool chests, each filled with the best equipment money could buy. Lily let go of his hand and took a few tentative steps into the space, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She walked up to a fiery red Jaguar E-Type and gently placed a single, small hand on its fender, her eyes wide with a reverence that mirrored her father's. Mark felt a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion. It was joy, it was gratitude, it was the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of a lifelong dream coming true so suddenly and completely. It felt like a physical impact. This wasn't just a garage, it was a promise fulfilled. It was the legacy motors from his sketchbook brought to life in breathtaking detail. Richard watched him, a knowing look in his eyes. "Miss Rossi thought you should have the proper tools for the job," he said. "She will be down to see you on Monday. She said to tell you to get acquainted with your patients." Richard handed Mark a small, heavy key card. "This opens this building and your house." "Welcome home, Mark." With that, he gave a small nod and left, the glass doors hissing shut behind him, leaving Mark and Lily alone in their new kingdom. Mark sank to his knees, the polished floor cold against his jeans. He pulled Lily into a tight hug, burying his face in her hair. She wrapped her small arms around his neck. "It's real, Daddy," she whispered into his ear. "It's all real." He held her close, the sheer, impossible reality of it all washing over him. He was home. The first few days in his new kingdom were a quiet revelation for Mark. After Richard left, he and Lily had explored their new home, a charming, two-bedroom stone cottage, nestled just out of sight of the main garage. It was fully furnished, beautifully decorated, and the kitchen was stocked with food. There was even a room for Lily that was already painted a soft shade of blue, with a new art desk and a full set of the shiny markers she had dreamed of. The sight of her sitting at that desk, meticulously drawing a silver Aston Martin, brought a fresh wave of tears to Mark's eyes. For the first time in his daughter's life, he hadn't had to say soon. But it was the garage, the sanctum, as he had started calling it in his mind, that truly occupied his thoughts. He spent that first weekend not working, but observing. With a clipboard and pen in hand, he walked the length of the collection, moving with a quiet reverence, a curator taking stock of his museum. He didn't just look at the cars, he studied them. He opened every door, sat in every driver's seat, inhaled the unique scent of each car's leather and wood. He ran his hands over the steering wheels, feeling the faint impressions left by the hands of previous owners. He gently popped every hood, his eyes scanning the engine bays with a surgeon's diagnostic gaze. By Sunday evening, he had a complete file on all 34 vehicles. He created a detailed chart noting each car's make, model, year, and VIN, but he went deeper. He created his own system, a more holistic assessment. He noted the state of the paint, the suppleness of the leather, the health of the engine, based on a visual inspection, the type of tires and their age. He added a section for personality, with notes like 2065 Mustang, feels aggressive, eager, engine looks strong but thirsty, or 2057 Gullwing, aristocratic, almost aloof, demands perfection, faint smell of old perfume in the cabin. He was not just cataloging assets, he was getting to know his patients. He was learning their histories and listening to the silent stories they told. He discovered that the previous maintenance team had done a competent but soulless job. The fluids were topped up, the batteries were on tenders, and the bodies were polished. But the souls were dormant. The carburetors on the Miura were slightly out of sync. He could see it in the soot on the plugs. The leather on the Rolls-Royce was clean but dry, crying out for conditioning. The magnificent machines were being preserved, but they weren't being cherished. That, he knew, was why Isabella had hired him. On Monday morning, he began. He didn't start with a flashy engine rebuild. He started with the basics, with respect. His first project was the 1959 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. It was a car that represented the pinnacle of quiet, old-world luxury. He spent the entire day not on its engine, but on its interior. He mixed a custom leather conditioner from lanolin and beeswax, a gentle, old-fashioned formula he trusted more than any modern chemical. He painstakingly worked the cream into every inch of the Connolly leather seats, the door panels, and the dashboard. He worked in slow, circular motions, massaging life back into the dry hides. As he worked, the leather softened, its rich, deep blue color returning from a dusty gray. He then turned his attention to the woodwork. The dashboard and door caps were burled walnut, but their finish had grown dull. He used a fine-grade polish, working with the grain, slowly coaxing out the wood's deep, intricate patterns until they shone with a warm, lustrous glow. He cleaned every chrome switch, every piece of brightwork, until the interior felt less like a car and more like the drawing room of a stately home. It was quiet, meditative work. It was the kind of deep, focused task he had always yearned for but never had the luxury of time to perform. There were no phones ringing, no customers demanding a quick fix, no pressure to cut corners to save a few dollars. There was only him, the car, and the pursuit of perfection. Isabella arrived late in the afternoon. She didn't announce herself, the silent glass doors sliding open to admit her. She was dressed in casual slacks and a cashmere sweater, a stark contrast to the power suit she had worn at their first meeting. She stood for a moment, watching him as he worked on the Rolls-Royce's interior, his focus absolute. "I see you've met the Grand Dame," she said, her voice calm and warm. Mark looked up, a little startled. He quickly wiped his hands on a clean rag and stood up. "Miss Rossi, I didn't hear you come in." "Please, Mark." "It's Isabella," she corrected him gently. "We're colleagues now." She walked over and peered into the Rolls-Royce. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the renewed richness of the interior. She could smell the faint, pleasant scent of beeswax and lemon oil. "My goodness, it looks alive again." "She just needed a little attention," Mark said, a touch of pride in his voice. The leather was getting dry. "I see you've started your assessments," she said, nodding toward the clipboard and the detailed charts he had created, which were now neatly organized on a large, clean workbench. She picked up the file for the Rolls-Royce and read his notes. She saw the technical details, but she also saw his personality assessment, the Grand Dame. Calm, dignified, but with a deep well of power, dislikes being rushed, requires a gentle but firm hand, the heart of the collection. A smile played on her lips. The Grand Dame. My father called her that too. He said driving it was like having tea with the Queen. "It feels that way," Mark agreed. "She's not a car you drive, she's a car you escort." Isabella looked around the immaculate space, at the rows of silent automotive legends. "This was my father's sanctuary," she said, her voice softer. "He'd come here after a long day at the office. He said the logic and honesty of these machines cleared his head. The corporate world can be messy, full of egos and politics. Here, things are simple. A problem has a solution. It's true or it's false. It works or it doesn't." She was echoing the same sentiment he had felt his entire life. He was starting to realize how similar she was to her father and, in a strange way, to himself. They were all searching for the same honesty, just in different arenas. "I found this in his old desk in the main house," she said, handing him a thin, leather-bound journal. "I thought you should have it." Mark took the journal. The leather was old and worn smooth. He opened it. The pages were filled with his father's elegant, slanted handwriting. It wasn't a diary, it was a service log. But like everything else Isabella's father had done, it was more than that. Beside the notations of oil changes and spark plug gaps were personal notes. The 10th of April, 1985, adjusted the timing on the GTO. "Isabella helped me, held the light. She has a good eye." Or, the 3rd of June, 1992, the DB5 has a slight hesitation off the line. Carburetor number 3 is running a bit rich. A problem for next weekend. Reminds me of the board meeting last week. One dissenting voice can throw off the whole balance. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just a service log. It was a conversation. It was a history of the man's relationship with his cars and with his daughter. It was the most valuable tool he could have been given. "Thank you, Isabella," he said, his voice husky. "This is invaluable." "I knew you would think so," she said. The previous team saw it as an outdated curiosity. They had everything logged on a tablet. She gestured around the vast space. "So, where do you plan to begin?" Mark took a deep breath, the journal feeling warm in his hand. He had his answer ready. "I'm going to work through them one by one, starting with the oldest and moving forward," he explained, his confidence growing. "A full, deep service for each, not just mechanicals, everything. I want to establish a new baseline of perfect health for every single car in this collection. I want to know them inside and out. I need to understand what each one needs before I can start any major restorations." He pointed to the Jaguar E-Type. "After the Rolls, she's next. There's a slight whine from the rear differential that I can hear even when it's standing still. And I want to get to the Miura's carburetors before the imbalance causes any real problems." Isabella listened, her expression one of deep satisfaction. He wasn't talking like a mechanic proposing a series of jobs. He was talking like a doctor laying out a long-term wellness plan for his patients. He was talking like a true curator. "That sounds like an excellent plan," she said. "My only instruction is this. Take your time. There are no deadlines here, except the ones you set for yourself. The budget is at your disposal. I want you to do the work you were born to do." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mark?" "Yes?" "Richard tells me Lily is a talented artist. There's an excellent school in the village with a very strong arts program. He's already taken the liberty of enrolling her. Classes start next week." And with that, she was gone, the glass doors hissing shut behind her, leaving Mark standing in the center of his new universe, holding a ghost journal in his hand, with the promise of a future for his daughter so bright it almost hurt to look at. He felt a wave of gratitude so immense it was a physical presence, filling every corner of the vast, silent garage. 6 months passed, and the rhythm of Mark's new life settled into a deeply satisfying hum, as steady and powerful as one of the engines he now so lovingly tended. The frantic, hand-to-mouth anxiety that had defined his existence for so long faded into a distant memory, replaced by the quiet confidence of a master who has finally been given the space to work. His days were a pilgrimage through automotive history. After perfecting the Rolls-Royce, he had moved on to the fiery 1961 Jaguar E-Type. He spent a full week on it, not just silencing the whine and the differential a worn bearing, as he'd suspected, but completely rebuilding the notoriously complex triple SU carburetor setup until the car idled with a silky, menacing hiss. He then moved to the brutish American muscle cars, tuning the 2069 Charger's 426 Hemi engine until its raw power was properly harnessed, a task he knew would have made his own father proud. He worked methodically, guided by his own meticulous charts and the invaluable insights from Mr. Rossi's journal. The journal became his Bible. He would read his predecessor's notes before starting on a car, learning its quirks and history, understanding the man through his mechanical relationship with the machine. It felt like a silent apprenticeship with a ghost. His relationship with Isabella evolved as well. She was no longer just a client or a boss. She had become a friend. She would often stop by the garage in the late afternoons, shedding her CEO persona at the door. She would bring them coffee, a special blend from a local roaster, and watch him work, asking intelligent questions, her understanding of the mechanics growing with each visit. They fell into a comfortable routine. He would explain the intricacies of a Bosch fuel injection system, and she would tell him about the complexities of a hostile takeover bid. He learned about the immense pressures she faced, the loneliness of being at the top, and the constant struggle to protect her father's corporate legacy from a board of directors who saw it only as a collection of assets. "They want to break up the company," she confessed one afternoon, her voice laced with fatigue as she leaned against the workbench while Mark polished the chrome on the Aston Martin DB5. "Sell off the divisions my father built. They say it's inefficient. They don't understand that the synergy between the parts is what makes it strong. They're like those first mechanics who looked at the Ferrari. They just want to replace the whole system. Some things aren't meant to be broken up," Mark said, his words carrying a double meaning. "They just need the right touch to make them work together." Isabella gave him a grateful smile. In this sanctuary of steel and logic, she had found the one person who seemed to understand the philosophy that guided her. Lily, meanwhile, was flourishing. The small village school was a world away from her old, overcrowded city school. Her artistic talent, nurtured by a dedicated teacher, blossomed. Her drawings became more detailed, more confident. She spent her afternoons in the garage, her headquarters, doing her homework at a small desk Mark had set up for her, the quiet hum of her father's work, the soundtrack to her studies. She knew the name of every car, its country of origin, and its superpower, as she called it. The Gullwing could fly with its doors, the Jaguar was super fast, and the Rolls-Royce was magic and quiet. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the trees outside the garage turned to brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Mark was finally ready to tackle his magnum opus. He had worked his way through nearly half the collection, bringing each car to a state of perfect mechanical and aesthetic health. Now, he stood before the car that had started it all. Isabella's 1960, two Ferrari 250, GTO. He had saved it for this moment. His temporary patch had gotten her home, but he had promised her perfection, and now he was ready to deliver. He had a deeper understanding of the collection, of Isabella, and of her father. He was no longer the intimidated mechanic from the rundown garage. He was the head curator, and this was his ultimate responsibility. Using Mr. Rossi's journal as his guide, he began a complete nut and bolt inspection. He found his father-in-law's notes on the car were the most detailed of all. The GTO is not a car. She is an opera. Every part must be in harmony, or the performance is ruined. She is temperamental, demanding, and utterly magnificent. Mark started with a full compression test, confirming the engine's core health was sound. He checked the suspension, the brakes, the electrical system. Everything was good, solid, but not perfect. He knew he could make it better. The real challenge, he discovered, lay hidden deep within the car's history. Tucked into a sleeve at the back of the journal was a faded, folded piece of paper. It was a letter from an old friend of Mr. Rossi's, a fellow car enthusiast in Italy, dated 1975. Enzo, the letter read, I heard from a friend at the factory about your GTO. The one you bought, chassis 3757 GT, has a unique history. It was one of the early prototypes used for testing a new transaxle design. They found a vibration at high RPMs they couldn't solve, so they refitted it with the standard gearbox before selling it. But the ghost remains, my friend. Be careful if you ever push her past 7,000 revolutions per minute. She will try to shake herself apart. Mark felt a jolt, as if he'd touched a live wire. The ghost remains. He reread the letter 3 times. A vibration. A design flaw from the factory that had never been truly solved. This explained so much. It explained the previous mechanic's clumsy attempts to fix the timing. He was likely chasing a symptom, not the root cause. It was a ghost in the machine, a fundamental imbalance that could only be felt at the very edge of the car's performance capabilities. Most owners would never notice. Most would never dare to push a priceless GTO to its 8,000 revolutions per minute redline. But Enzo Rossi would have. And Mark knew with absolute certainty that Isabella would too. She had her father's spirit. Giving her back a car that wasn't safe at its limits was unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of his promise of perfection. He went back to the car, his perspective completely changed. He was no longer just tuning an engine, he was hunting a ghost. He put the car on the hydraulic lift, raising it into the air. He lay on a creeper and rolled underneath, his work light illuminating the car's underbelly. He examined the entire drivetrain, from the engine block back to the differential. He looked at the transmission, the drive shaft, the half shafts leading to the wheels. Everything looked perfect, standard. The factory had indeed replaced the experimental transaxle. So where was the ghost? He spent the rest of the day in a state of deep concentration. Lily came in from school and saw the look on his face, the same intense, focused look he'd had when he first worked on the Ferrari, and knew not to disturb him. She simply sat at her desk and began to draw, occasionally glancing up at her father as he moved around, under, and inside the beautiful red car. The problem, Mark reasoned, couldn't be in the parts that were replaced. It had to be in the parts that remained. What would have been affected by the installation of an experimental transaxle? The mounting points? The chassis balance? The drive shaft? He focused on the drive shaft. It was a long, simple tube of steel that connected the engine's power to the wheels. It looked fine, but when he ran his hands over it, he felt something. A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple in the metal. It wasn't damage, it looked like a weld. A very clean, professional weld, but a weld nonetheless. Why would a drive shaft be welded? They were supposed to be single, balanced pieces of steel. He consulted the GTO's original factory specifications, which he found in a dusty technical manual on a bookshelf. The drive shaft was meant to be a single piece. This one had been modified. His heart began to beat faster. He realized what must have happened. The experimental transaxle was likely a different length than the standard one. To make it fit, the factory mechanics would have had to shorten the drive shaft. Instead of fabricating a new one, they had simply cut a section out of the original and welded it back together. A quick, clever fix for a prototype. But when they refitted the standard gearbox, they had left the modified drive shaft in place. A welded drive shaft would be inherently, microscopically out of balance. At low speeds, it would be unnoticeable. But at 7,000 revolutions per minute, spinning thousands of times per minute, that tiny imbalance would create a massive, destructive vibration, the ghost. Mark felt a surge of pure, triumphant adrenaline. He had found it. He had found the ghost. He stood up, his mind racing. The solution was simple in theory, but incredibly complex in practice. He couldn't just order a new drive shaft for a 1,962 Ferrari 250 GTO. The part didn't exist. It would have to be fabricated from scratch. It would require custom machining, perfect balancing, and a deep understanding of metallurgy. It was the most challenging piece of fabrication he had ever considered, a task that would test the very limits of his skill. He looked at the magnificent red car, no longer a patient but a worthy adversary. This was the final exam. This was the test that would prove whether he was simply a great mechanic or a true master. He pulled out his old leather-bound sketchbook, the one from his previous life, which he now kept on his new workbench, and opened it to a fresh page. He began to draw, not a fantasy this time, but a plan. A detailed, precise, engineering blueprint for the heart of a legend. The final piece of the puzzle that would exorcise the ghost for good. The ghost hunt consumed Mark. For the next 2 weeks, the gleaming sanctum of the garage became a laboratory dedicated to a single, obsessive purpose: fabricating a perfect, seamless heart for the GTO. This was no longer just a repair. It was a resurrection. It was the kind of challenge he had drawn in his sketchbooks in his youth, a fusion of artistry and engineering that pushed the boundaries of his craft. He began by carefully removing the flawed drive shaft. As it rested on his workbench, the faint circular weld was like a scar, a subtle mark of its imperfect history. He measured it with calipers and micrometers, his notations precise to 1/1000th of an inch. He analyzed its weight, its composition, its every dimension. This was his template. His first call was to a specialty metal supplier, a firm he found referenced in the back of Mr. Rossi's journal. He didn't just order a tube of steel. He ordered a specific chromium molybdenum alloy, renowned for its strength and resistance to torsional stress, the same type of steel used in the original construction, but of a superior, modern quality. When the raw, uncut tube of steel arrived, it looked unremarkable. But to Mark, it was a blank canvas. The real work was about to begin. The garage, which had been a quiet place of maintenance and restoration, transformed into a true workshop. The air filled with the sharp, clean smell of cutting fluid and the hum of machinery. He used the large metal lathe in the workshop, a machine he had only used for small bushings and fittings until now, to cut the steel tube to the precise length. The process was nerve-wracking. A single slip of the hand, a miscalculation of a fraction of a millimeter, and the entire expensive piece of alloy would be ruined. He worked with immense concentration, his hands steady, his eyes shielded as tiny spirals of metal peeled away from the spinning tube. Next came the most critical phase: machining the yokes. These were the fork-shaped ends of the drive shaft that connected to the transmission and the differential. Their splines had to be perfect to ensure a secure, vibration-free fit. He spent 3 full days on the milling machine, a task of intense, mind-numbing precision. He would cut a groove, stop, measure, check his schematics, and cut again. He was in a world of his own, a place where only tolerances and specifications mattered. Lily would come in after school and watch him, silent and fascinated, as he coaxed intricate shapes out of raw metal. Isabella stopped by one afternoon, drawn by the unfamiliar sounds of heavy machinery. She found him hunched over the milling machine, his face taut with concentration, his hands guiding the powerful tool with a surgeon's grace. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched for 20 minutes, completely mesmerized. She was witnessing a man at the absolute peak of his abilities, a master completely at one with his craft. It was the same look of fierce, joyful focus she sometimes saw on the faces of her top research scientists when they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Finally, after a week of machining, the pieces were ready. A perfect tube and 2 flawless yokes. Now, they had to become one. Welding them required a level of skill far beyond that of a typical mechanic. The welds had to be so strong, so deeply penetrated into the metal, that the shaft would behave as a single, solid piece. He used a TIG welder, a process that allowed for incredible precision. He laid down a bead of molten metal so clean and so perfect, it looked less like a weld and more like a natural part of the steel. But the final, most crucial step was balancing. This was where the factory mechanics had failed. A drive shaft, even a perfectly constructed one, needs to be dynamically balanced, much like a car's tire, but to an infinitely more precise degree. Any microscopic imbalance in weight distribution would cause a vibration at high speeds. He constructed a custom rig using digital sensors and a high-speed motor. He mounted the newly fabricated drive shaft and spun it up, faster and faster. The sensors, connected to a laptop, displayed the results as a complex waveform. Just as he suspected, there was a tiny vibration, a matter of mere grams, but enough to create the ghost. Now began the most painstaking process of all. He would spin the shaft, identify the heavy spot via the computer, and then meticulously grind away a tiny amount of material, sometimes just a whisper of metal dust. Then he would spin it again, check the results, and repeat. It was a slow, iterative dance of man and machine, a search for perfect equilibrium. For 2 days, he did nothing else, sometimes spending an hour to remove a single gram of metal in just the right spot. Finally, on a quiet Friday afternoon, he achieved it. He spun the shaft up to a simulated 10,000 revolutions per minute, far beyond the car's red line. On the screen, the chaotic waveform smoothed out into a perfect, flat line. The ghost was gone. He stood back from the rig, his body aching with fatigue, his hands stained with grease and metal dust. He looked at the finished drive shaft, gleaming under the workshop lights. It was, without a doubt, the single finest piece of mechanical work he had ever produced. It was a physical manifestation of his journey, a testament to his skill, his patience, and his promise. The installation was a ceremony. He cleaned the Ferrari's undercarriage one last time before carefully fitting the new drive shaft into place. The splines slid home with a satisfying perfect click. He torqued the bolts to the exact factory specification. He was not just installing a part, he was completing a legend. That evening, he called Isabella. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, bone-deep satisfaction. "The ghost is gone." "Are you sure, Mark?" "I'm positive. But there's only one way to truly know. We need to take her for a test drive, not just around the estate, somewhere we can let her run." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I know a place," Isabella said. "An old, decommissioned airfield about an hour from here. It's private. We won't be disturbed. Be ready tomorrow at dawn." The next morning was cool and clear, the sky a pale pre-dawn purple. Mark rolled the GTO out of the garage. In the soft light, it looked more beautiful than ever. Isabella arrived, not in her usual sedan, but driving a modern Ferrari, a sleek silver SF90 Stradale. She was dressed in a simple black driving suit. She looked like a woman ready for business. "Shall we?" she said, a thrill of anticipation in her eyes. The drive to the airfield was a convoy of legends, old and new. Mark drove the GTO, the engine note, a deep, confident purr. The car felt different. It felt tighter, more solid, more whole. They arrived at the abandoned airfield as the sun began to crest the horizon, bathing the long, empty runway in golden light. It was a vast, open space, a perfect ribbon of asphalt stretching for nearly 2 miles. Isabella got out of her car and walked over to the GTO. "My father and I used to come here," she said softly. "He taught me how to drive fast on this runway." She looked at Mark. "Will you drive her first?" Mark shook his head. "She's your car. She's your father's car. You should be the one to do the honors." He handed her the keys. Isabella slid into the driver's seat. It had been years since she had truly pushed this car. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the wooden steering wheel. Mark stood on the edge of the runway, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Isabella put the car in gear and pulled onto the runway. She started slow, accelerating through first, then second gear. The engine sang, its voice clear and strong. She shifted into third, the V12's roar growing more intense, a sound that echoed across the empty landscape. The car rocketed down the runway, a flash of crimson against the gray asphalt. Mark watched the tachometer through the rear window, his eyes glued to the needle. 4,000 revolutions per minute. 5,000. 6,000. The car was a blur now. 6,000. 500. This was the territory where the ghost had lived. He held his breath. 7,000 revolutions per minute. The engine screamed, a glorious, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated power. But the car remained perfectly steady. There was no vibration, no shudder. It was as smooth and solid as a block of granite. Isabella kept her foot planted. 7,500 revolutions per minute. She shifted into fourth gear, the engine note dropping for a split second before climbing again, howling its magnificent opera. The needle kissed the 8,000 revolutions per minute red line. She held it there for a moment, a pilot pushing her machine to the very edge of its limits, a perfect union of woman and machine. She was not just driving a car, she was dancing with her father's memory, and for the first time, the dance was flawless. She finally eased off the throttle, letting the car coast, the engine crackling and popping as it cooled. She drove it back slowly and pulled up next to Mark, shutting off the engine. She sat in the silence for a long moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She turned to look at Mark, and he saw that her face was wet with tears. But these were not tears of sadness or nostalgia. They were tears of pure, unbridled joy. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The ghost is really gone." "It's perfect, Mark. It's absolutely perfect." Mark felt a grin spread across his face, a wave of relief and pride, so powerful it felt like a physical force. He had done it. He hadn't just fixed a car. He had conquered a legend. He had honored a father's legacy and given a daughter back a piece of her soul. The successful exorcism of the GTO's ghost marked a turning point. It was more than just the completion of a difficult job. It was the final, definitive proof of Mark's mastery. The news of the legendary car's perfect restoration and the incredible story of its hidden flaw quietly rippled through the exclusive and tight-knit world of high-end car collectors. For Mark, however, the true reward wasn't the burgeoning reputation, but the look of pure joy on Isabella's face as she stepped out of the car at the airfield. In the months that followed, their partnership solidified into a powerful alliance. Inspired by Mark's methodical restoration of her father's automotive legacy, Isabella approached her corporate challenges with a new perspective. She stopped trying to fight her board with aggression and instead began to educate them with passion and logic, much like Mark had educated her about the cars. She prepared a presentation, not of spreadsheets and profit projections, but of history and purpose. She told the story of how her father built each division, how they were designed to work in synergy, how breaking them apart would be like selling off the engine, wheels, and chassis of a priceless car separately. "You would have a collection of valuable parts," she told the stunned board members, "but you would lose the vehicle. You would destroy the legacy." Her new approach, backed by Mark's quiet confidence which had become her own, won them over. The plan to break up the company was defeated. Isabella had saved her father's corporate legacy, using the very philosophy she had learned in the sanctuary of the garage. One beautiful spring afternoon, nearly a year after Mark and Lily had first arrived, Isabella found Mark in the main garage, not working on a car, but standing before a large, covered object in the center of the floor. Lily was beside him, her sketchbook in hand, a look of excitement on her face. "I was told there was a surprise," Isabella said, smiling as she approached. "It's finished," Mark said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. He looked at Lily, who gave him an eager nod. Together, they took hold of the large silk sheet covering the object. "I wanted you to be the first to see it." They pulled the sheet away. Underneath was not a car, but a magnificent museum-quality exhibit. It was the Ferrari GTO's original, flawed drive shaft, mounted on a stand of polished walnut and brushed steel. Next to it was the faded letter from Mr. Rossi's friend, now professionally framed under archival glass. And next to that was a page from Mark's own sketchbook, his initial drawing for the new drive shaft also framed. The exhibit was titled simply, "The Ghost in the Machine, a story of imperfection and a legacy perfected." Isabella was speechless. It was an incredibly thoughtful tribute, a testament to their shared journey. It honored her father, the car's history, and Mark's own incredible craftsmanship. "But that's not the main surprise," Mark said, guiding her past the display toward his old workbench. On it, propped up for her to see, was a large, professionally printed architectural blueprint. At the top, the title read, "The Rossi Collection at Legacy Motors, a center for automotive preservation and education." Isabella looked at the plans, her eyes widening. The blueprints detailed a careful and respectful expansion of the current facility. It included a public-facing gallery to display a rotating selection of the cars, a small reference library, and a classroom space. The most stunning feature was a new wing, the Mark Evans Restoration Workshop, a state-of-the-art facility with glass walls, allowing visitors to watch master craftsmen at work. "My father's journal talked about his dream of one day sharing the collection with the public," Mark explained, his voice steady. "He wanted to inspire the next generation of engineers and designers. I think this is how we do it. We don't just preserve the cars. We preserve the passion behind them. We create a living legacy." Isabella stared at the plans, then back at Mark. He was no longer just her curator. He was her partner, a visionary in his own right. He wasn't just maintaining her father's legacy. He was building upon it, making it stronger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. Legacy Motors, she said softly, touching the name on the blueprint. It's perfect. A few years later, on a sun-drenched Saturday, the dream on that blueprint was a stunning reality. The grand opening of the Rossi collection at Legacy Motors was a major event. The world of classic cars had descended on the estate, mingling with engineering students, local families, and art enthusiasts. The gallery was filled with a hushed reverence as people admired the gleaming machines. Through the large glass walls of the new workshop, visitors watched as a team of young mechanics, all personally trained and mentored by Mark, worked on a vintage Alfa Romeo. Mark, dressed in a sharp blazer but with his signature clean, capable hands, stood near the entrance, greeting guests. He was no longer haunted by the weight of the past, but was a confident, respected figure, a man who had found his purpose. Lily, now a bright, talented teenager with a clear eye on a future in automotive design, stood beside him, her own designs featured in a special student exhibit. Isabella took the podium to address the crowd. She spoke of her father, of his passion, and of her own journey to understand his legacy. A legacy is not just something you inherit, she said, her eyes finding Mark in the crowd. It's something you build upon, something you share. It requires more than just preservation. It requires the right touch, a deep respect for the past, and a clear vision for the future. I was fortunate enough to find a curator, a partner, who possessed that vision. She raised a glass. To my father, Enzo, and to the future of his legacy. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the estate, Mark and Isabella stood on a quiet balcony overlooking the gallery. They watched as a father knelt to explain the engine of the GTO to his wide-eyed son, much as Mr. Rossi had once done with Isabella. He would have loved this, Isabella said, her voice filled with a peaceful contentment. You've given him a kind of immortality, Mark. You're the one who gave me the chance, Mark replied. You saw something in a struggling mechanic in a rundown garage. I saw an artist who didn't know his own value, she corrected him, and a good man who just needed the right tools to build his dream. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the legacy play out before them. It was a legacy no longer confined to a private garage but shared with the world, a testament to the idea that true worth is measured not in money, but in passion, integrity, and the courage to mend what is broken, whether it's the heart of an engine or the heart of a life. Mark's journey began with a pile of unpaid bills and a nearly forgotten dream. It was a chance encounter, a moment of trust that opened the door to a new life. It proves that our greatest talents can often feel like our heaviest burdens until we meet someone who sees them for what they truly are, a gift. The mechanic who was drowning in debt became the curator of a world-class legacy, not just by fixing cars, but by demonstrating that honesty, passion, and the courage to be true to your craft are the most valuable currencies of all. Thank you for joining us on UpStory. What part of Mark's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts. And if you were inspired by this story, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more uplifting stories just like this one. Until next time, keep looking for the magic in every moment.